Some of our colleagues could not attend today, so we wish them well and encourage you to explore their work, and I'll mention them in different ways. So already we will start with one person that is kind of important for this original proposal. It's of the concept around citizen science, and unfortunately she got ill with COVID and can't come. So Jacquie McGlade was supposed to come and start the event, and I'll pretend to be Jacquie. It is impossible to be anything remotely like Jacquie, but I can at least say what she wanted to say, and I'll explain what. Let's start. So this event is also, you'll notice, both from Jacquie's comment and from mine, that it's not a tinge of sadness, because we have two colleagues who've been important to this project and contribute in different ways, and are no longer with us today. So one of the biggest implementation of the work that we've done of engaging indigenous communities in sharing environmental data happened in the Masai Mara under the guidance of Jacquie McGlade, who been a professor at UCL. She's a professor at the Institute of Global Prosperity, and also involved in the University of Masai Mara, and carry out significant work over there. The implementation in the Masai Mara include thousands of records and an example of a community both recording the information and using it in an effective way. The person that led the work in this area is Vincent Ochieng-Siru. And Vincent was a member of the Institute of Global Prosperity at UCL. He was an inspiration for young people in the area of Masai Mara. He took to each research project like a crocodile to the river, from mapping the geothermal plant impact on the indigenous tree to the deployment and maintenance of more than 150 camera traps and audio modes for the team at UCL Center for Biodiversity and Environmental Research, working on a biome project with the WWF. He always figured out what to do and kept the best record from the field, and we had a very effective collaboration with him around Sapelli. He was killed in the park next to where we live, and he is really missed by everyone, young and old, across the research community in Kenya. In terms of what the project itself involved, the project that was done around agri-food came out of work with Sapelli, which you will hear more about this afternoon. With it, they could accurately map the forest and tag the traditional knowledge with it. The two icons are the design that were chosen to represent prosperity by the Maasai, and the Kalenjin living in the forest area. And the work that they included, they used Sapelli to produce one of the most extensive and detailed mapping of an African tropical mountain forest, as well as applying it to farming and agricultural supply chains along the Rift Valley. It has been a citizen science program that involving more than 400 people with an effect on 100,000 households. And also importantly, it's also one of the first examples of using the technology that we will talk about today, and the project we talk about today, together with data that comes from satellite and machine learning and artificial intelligence. So the project has been so successful that a new community has been formed, and with projects that launch on carbon market in Kenya, as well as create a social and natural capital benefit for all. So medicine, non-nutritional food, and clean energy, all from smart start with Sapelli and the team that was supported by UCL and the Institute of Global Prosperity. So that kind of collaboration between us and the Institute of Global Prosperity is something very valuable, and something also that it's interesting. The nails that you see there are linked with near field communication. So you can actually put them into trees and then record it with the application, and that can provide a demonstration for carbon market and other things. So that was my imitation of Jacquie, which wasn't very successful. So now I'll tell you myself. So I'm Muki Haklay. I haven't introduced myself yet because Jacquie was supposed to introduce me. So apologies for that. And I'm going to talk to you about the journey. So what we are doing here today, we are celebrating the end of a project called Extreme Citizen Science Analysis with Visualization. The project was kindly funded by the European Research Council, and it's been going on now since 2016, so almost 6 years with the different extension that they generally provided us. And what I'm going to cover in the next 15 minutes is a description of my own journey and my own perspective. You will hear again and again throughout this afternoon, you will see it actually in the different demonstration, that one of our principles is plurality, and plurality of point of view. And although you'll hear that I'm coming from a specific perspective, it was never my goal or my aim to influence other members of the research group to follow it. If they liked what I suggested them as material to reading, great, but a lot of them didn't. So that meant that my paper remained mine, nobody else can join me. But it's actually, there is this kind of interaction between different views that allow this ability to consider different things. So where did I start? I actually started from being interested in public access to environmental information. So that's me during my PhD, dragging people from the other side of London all the way to UCL, putting them in front of the computer so they can see information that the Environment Agency was holding about them. Why have I been doing that? I've been doing that because that year there is something called Aarhus Convention, or the Convention on Public Access to Environmental Information, participation in decision-making and access to justice. And that convention was actually changing the way that people were supposed to access information. And one of the things that we're talking about is that public authorities should release information to the public. And the question is, why should they release it? Who wants this information? So I was starting to explore it with different people. And what was interesting is very quickly people turned from looking at the information and asking, hey, this information is wrong. I want to change it. And the people that were in the room were people that never used a computer before. They didn't have to use, they didn't know how to use a mouse. So I was using issues that won't mean anything to anyone in the room, but maybe let's see. Anyone know what Etch-a-Sketch is? You do? Yeah. So Etch-a-Sketch is a toy that in my childhood, you were playing with two knobs that kind of move in different directions. And that's how you explain to people how mouse work. And people took over the mouse, first time in their life, because they wanted to collect environmental information about the community. Now, you start an academic career and you have to say goodbye to some of these things, especially if you are in the geographic engineering department that completely understand what's going on with participatory mapping. But it became more possible by 2007 with things like Google Maps API. And that is actually the very early demonstration of what will become later on mapping for change and community maps, and demonstrated that we can do things in more very interesting things. And while I'm working on that and kind of thinking of the first project in which we were doing that in a large scale, working with communities around the Olympic area, I'm getting an email. So it's small, but I'll read it for you. So, dear Muki, I started UCL in September in the Department of Social Anthropology. And your colleagues at UCL suggested we contact you for advice. That's Jerome, somewhere in May 2007. So nothing here, nothing here would not be possible without this email. And that's the map that Jerome was sharing with me at the time, using a very heavy device that he'll talk about, and I won't spoil his presentation. But the reason he contacted me in this email is actually saying, hey, there is the Grand Challenges application for UCL, what will become Grand Challenges, and you can apply for £10,000. So can we put something together so we can start developing this mapping software for and think about something that we call intelligent maps, so something that will allow communities will help you to see the information. So we submitted, and it fails. And what is interesting is I'll read you what was the response that we received about the failure. So the comment that we received from the chair of the panel was, is it clear that even if everything worked, there would be any real value for these sort of devices? And then you use the example that the forest people might be able to tell if there were poachers in the area. Yet, can that be really be shown? Do forest people understand probabilistic reasoning? If the device failed, what backup or support will there be? Will there be an adequate power supply? Is there an evidence that illiterate people can use maps, digital or otherwise? Okay, so that's, we're talking about 2008, something like that. And I don't like no as an answer, so I continue to apply. And we kind of try with EPSLC once, we tried with EPSLC second time, and finally there was a good problem. So the program that gave the breakthrough is something called challenging engineering. And thank God for that, because it was finally looking for interdisciplinary project, and they really liked the concept of the combination between human-computer interaction and anthropology and geography and other things, and that's where the name Extreme Citizen Science came about as the application. And the excites come from Tiziano Rosetto, a colleague in civil engineering, who didn't like the idea that we'll call it Excitesy, which is what Jerome and I came with, and dropped the CI at the end of after the S and said, just leave it Excites. And she was right. So thanks to Tiziano on that. And what is important to tell in this story is actually the importance of this long-term funding. So actually, if you look at the funding, in the end, it was possible to drive this money, which was £1 million, to 6 years. So between 2011 and 2017. And then the money that came after that from the European Research Council, which is an amazing funder. I have to say that's an opportunity to actually say a huge thank you. I never in my whole career came across a funder that basically tried to help you in any way you need. You basically write an email, even at the end of it, like we had, this event is on the 5th of July. So I'm writing, can we just stretch the project by a week so we can have it? So they said, hey, every month. You know, and they extended the project by a month. And all that within an afternoon. It's just a funder that wants to help the researchers that are involved in it as much as they want, while also making sure that they are doing it right. So for example, the ethics process, they are kind of remind you about the ethics of your process and checking with it and give you advice and everything else. But this type of funding allows us to go after other fundings and kind of develop the things that we hear about in this afternoon. And here's how I presented Excites at 2011, and kind of explaining, you'll hear with this idea of plurality, this kind of the difference, another approach from it immediately. But kind of main citizen science was at that time and understood that something that mostly educated, usually some domain knowledge, and people you could see actually the data was collected mostly at wealthy, populated and popular area. The data collection and entry is what you do, and the mode of work is mostly crowdsourcing. And the extreme citizen science is kind of thinking how we make it open to everyone. And another thing that I've done at the time, and I'll talk about it in a minute with the theory, is this type of thing, which I'm sorry that it's a pyramid. It's actually non-hierarchical, and the text that come with it about different classification of citizen science, I mentioned that it's non-hierarchical. But the visual is telling a different story. And what I was saying at the time is, and it's still kind of relevant to what we're thinking, all those slides are from 2011, from 10 11 years ago. Sorry. So it's a research group that focused on the theory, methodology, and technique and tool that needed to allow any community to start their own citizen science activity. And citizen science activity is understood in a wider sense of the concept. And the range of people that were involved in the project at the beginning, that's kind of the first group that were members of this group, and some of them are here in the room and recruited on the back of this PPSLC project. And they started engaging in different ways, coming from different backgrounds. But what is interesting is that there is a name here on the list, Jess Wardlow, who was doing her PhD on big data with the NHS and all the rest of it. She's now a citizen science specialist in the Natural History Museum. If we can say that someone became really mainstream professional in citizen science out of the group, is the person who joined in and kind of interested in the different activities. And that's something that I'm talking a little bit about the nature of the group itself. By 2012, because of Matthias, we'll hear from him later on, we could have Sapelli, the tool that you'll hear a lot about, and continue to develop it also with Michalis Vitos and Julia Aldenbucher, who joined the whole effort to writing it, and other people that join in to writing the backend and the community mapping. There is a whole set of people that have been involved in the technical operation around it and are important for it, but also different people who done different work in the field. And that includes a lot of going away and researching things in different places and trying to see if a technology work or not. For example, there you can see Julia Altenbucher doing work on understanding the nature of mapping and the coverage of the different areas. And also people having good group spirit. So in this imagery, you can see the different members of the group together, including a visitor from Brazil, but within the team of ECSAnVis, you can see Artus, Matthias Stevens, Michalis Vitos, Julia Altenbucher, and Jane Conquest. Well, unfortunately, is no longer with us and will step along. So that allows us to, with this group, to actually co-create. And one of the principles was that everyone can contribute to the project and tell us what we should do with it. And that's how we can, as a group, and that's why I'm using the we. It's not, ECSAnVis is not a project that I created. It's a group that was created together with different people of thinking, we got data collection tool, now we have some prototype of a data management tool. What we need is the analysis and visualization tool that we are creating. So what is this project ECSAnVis about? First of all, it's about addressing urgent needs of different remote and marginalized groups and kind of promoting them. And you can see on the, I recommend you to look at this poster on the side, which covered 20 cases. We were stunned actually when we recorded all of them to realize that we already have 20 case studies in different places. It's also about the tools, methodologies, and techniques that we talked about. It's the demonstration of the principle that any community can meaningfully participate in to create citizen science. And I'll talk a little bit about the theory, the experiment in deep democratization of technology. So I'll start with addressing the need of community, and that's the ability to bring Jill in.
The key thing for me that is really interesting about this project is the possibility of using modern technology in order to assist populations who are living in very remote environments and a much closer relationship with those environments than we do in the West, to adapt to the massive changes that are being driven by consumer culture in the West and largely by the big drivers technology that is happening in other parts of the world. Most of the resources that are used in things like laptops and mobile phones and other digital devices come from remote rainforest environments, and unfortunately the process of extracting these minerals can often have huge disadvantages for the communities who are living there. And so what I really like about this project is that it aims to turn the tables, as it were, by adapting digital devices and allowing people who live in a completely different cultural, spatial, ecological environment to use them in order to respond to the big global environmental challenges that we're all facing on a much more equal level.
I couldn't possibly say better than that. Whoops. So what are the other things that we're going on? We absolutely developed the methodologies and the tools that are involved with it. I mentioned Sapelli, but that was interesting. What is the software is actually part of a socio-technical process. We're not seeing the software as something that happened alone. We're seeing it as something that's being used within a specific context and a process of use. And it's being explained and shared in this way, even now with peer-reviewed papers that allow us to share this information forward. We also, through those 20 cases that you see there, demonstrated that with appropriate support, anyone can co-create citizen science. So something that looked very alien to a lot of people at the beginning of it, that it's something that only educated people can be involved in. We are demonstrating, I think, in a really concrete way that anyone can participate in a meaningful way and contribute if it's suitable for them and if we take their needs into account. Not just that, work that Marcus Moreu has done in the past few years demonstrated that even complex concepts like polygons and areas and other things can be captured if you design them properly. So the kind of assumption that it's only scientists who can do science is just doesn't fit into a world where we have both the tools and the ability to share it with different people. And that's quite, I know, radical and extreme in a way, but it's demonstrating it. We are not just saying it. You got 20 examples of that. Now let's talk a little bit about the theory, and I'll do a really quick tour of the theory. So the first thing that you notice, and the kind of echoing the things that I showed you, is this background of concept of citizen participation. Now, for people who are coming from urban planning and geography, that's kind of something that you hear at some point that you want to study. It's a story of Sherry Arnstein and the way that in 1969, she created the ladder of citizen participation. It's got a name, Arnstein ladder, and it talks about different ways in which it starts for non-participation, where authorities are manipulating the public, all the way to citizen control over the process, which is the top of it. And on the back of this ladder, there is actually the Arnstein Ladder Factory, which I'm a proud member of because I've also contributed to that. Some people are reading what I've done as a ladder of that. But that's kind of, there is a lot of people with this concept. And again, citizen science is disrupting it and kind of telling you that different levels of participation are suitable for different people at different times in their life. And you can't just assume that everyone just wants all the power all the time. And that brings us into different concepts of citizen science. So there is the concept that Alan Irwin was suggesting in suggested in 1995, or the concept that Rick Bonney suggested. And one of them is slightly more towards the crowdsourcing, the Rick Bonney one, and one is more towards the participation, kind of the bit that I was coming into with my work that I showed you in 1998. That's coming from this direction about citizen participation in sustainability. Another element of the mishmash that in my head about the different theory is something called post-normal science, where when you are kind of talking about situation where facts are centered, values are in dispute, stakes are high, and decisions are urgent, you are in a situation where your normal science, as that's coming from Thomas Kuhn, the concept of normal science with paradigm that kind of stabilize and kind of find different aspects and so on, doesn't work anymore. You can't just take scientists to advise you or to work in the professional consultancy area, think about the early situation that we just experienced with COVID. The scientists don't know what's going on. Okay, they don't know, they don't have the tool. And what Silvio Funtowicz and Jerome Rabbit, who develop post-normal science, are saying that in those situations, you need to kind of rethink how you do the science policy interface. And you do that through a concept of extended peer community. So extending the range of issues, and we're talking also about extended facts. That's actually mapped directly to the Alan Irwin concept of citizen science, where you think about the way that local knowledge and indigenous knowledge and other things fit into scientific decisions. Now, with that, you also need to consider what's the role of technology. So my own take on it is coming from two people. Critical philosophy of technology is coming from someone called Andrew Finberg and Albert Borgman. I'll talk with you a little bit about Finberg because that's the center of what I'll talk at the moment. So you see that there is a lot of influences, and those are mine. They are not influencing the rest of the group. And actually, in some way, and I'll talk about it, it was an experiment. I'm not going to enforce the theory on the rest of the people in the group. And let's see what we come up with and what kind of ideas are coming in. And the kind of concept of Andrew Finberg about technology is the following way. In technology, if you think about technology as a force, you can think about it as an autonomous force. Okay, and that was something that actually was very common in the 19th century and the early 20th century. It's something that it's running on its own. It doesn't matter if you'll do it or someone else will do it. It will continue in its own direction. And if you think that it's neutral, so it doesn't have any goal, it can be used for good or for bad. So this kind of the example of that is that gun don't kill people, people kill people type of things, that even the most extreme instrument that you can say integrate value is actually just instrumental. Then you end up with this type of if you say that it's autonomous and neutral, you will end up with some sort of determinism that it's kind of maybe progressing for good, maybe progressing. But if you say that it's value laden, that you can't change the values and the values are integrated in, you end up with fairly pessimistic position, which is the one at the bottom. That's a substantivism point about technology. The other way around, and that one that most of us are thinking in most days, is that technology is neutral, and while it's humanly controlled, while we are deciding what it is, you know, Facebook was not designed to be, you know, it's been just an instrument, and you can use it for good or for bad. And actually, if you are saying that it does have value, which leads us to the last point, and that's where I learned from Andrew Finberg and from others to think about, then you're actually in a situation where you say there are values embedded in technology. It is controlled by humans, and therefore we can shape it and we can think about where we want technology to be. And that's where this concept of deep democratization is coming in. And he mentioned it in a book in 1999. And he was saying that if you want to think about the way people are operating with technology, then technical representation is not primarily about the selection of trusted personnel, but involve the embodiment of social and political demands in technical codes. So it's not enough to have the, you know, Facebook review board or something like that of people that we trust. You actually want to change it. And therefore you change it from within through intervention by the users as you design the technology. And in a way, what we've been doing within ECSAnVis is an experiment in this deep democratization. We are doing co-design with people that are remote from technology, as you can think about today. And we're kind of thinking about the way in which we allow them to co-create the technology in different ways. And we're doing that with ethics, with the values, and explicitly using the values in the design. But it's also showing us the limitation of this concept, because there is ICT infrastructure that comes with the values for which we can't change. all kind of changes in the Android and software and other things that we're using that we can influence. And finally, the social societal system and structure, such as the way we manage forests and so on. And you'll hear about it in the second part. So quickly, what are my final lessons from that? From these 15, 11 years, depending how we count it, of this ECSAnVis project, ECSAnVis and the Extreme Citizen Science project. So one thing that I've learned, and it worked fantastically well throughout this period, is to be open. Anyone who's interested and express interest was welcome to join. And some people became, through that, PhD students and working in the project, and that's been amazing way of working. The second thing is the project, despite the neatness of research proposal, they're a mixture of plans, science fiction, myth, and a lot of mess that happening around. And therefore, it's not mine. I never seen those projects or any of the projects in the group as mine. And actually, those that are doing that can take over and lead to it. You can call it an internal bureaucracy. But you also need to think about egalitarian knowledge production. It doesn't work just to say that we work with the citizen with it, while running the group along the classic academic line, where the professor is first, then the postdoc can harass the PhDs, who can harass the MSc students, who just use undergraduate for all kind of purposes. And there are groups like that. But if you are kind of flattening the whole thing, and it's not ideal, and it's not perfect, and it can't happen in all situations, and I won't pretend that it was perfectly flat, you get interesting results. You also kind of work with no-fail experiment, where we're continuously learning about the approaches. The egalitarian approach that I mentioned to you is also something that was really important in terms of the people that are involved, including the people that are on the scientific management. So we've been extremely lucky throughout this project to have someone who is now a doctor in ecology, another person who is a producer, a TV producer in Scotland, another person who is an early web entrepreneur with huge knowledge with databases and other things, and someone who is clinical leader in the NHS, clinical test trial leader. You can't get these people if you are working with them and assuming that it's kind of just an administrative job. They are part of the group, and it's interaction that are actually becoming on a flat level that allow it to happen. And we need to do it more in academia more generally. And the development of case studies, all those 20 case studies, non-linear. One of our longest case study, the one that Jerome probably will talk about it now, is kind of stop and start with different actors, but we still got the PhD students at the moment in the field, continuing the same trajectory from 16, 17 years, something like that. Yeah. So active, and finally, my own lesson is that because we could have ended up being marginalized out of it because of the way we work, being active in shaping the field, and I became very involved in influencing citizen science more generally, was something that was working in terms of ensuring that now co-creation and other things are seen as important in citizen science, and also that this practice of extreme citizen science is seen as an integral part. So that's me, and now it's time to hear something else.
So it's been 15, 16, 17 years or so we've been working on this, and there's a lot to try and summarize in just a few minutes. As you can see, Muki has rather overrun in his enthusiasm, but and I'm likely to do a little bit also, but I hope you'll bear with us. So what I'm going to try and just explain something about now is why we call this extreme citizen science, and why not just normal citizen science. But to do that, I have to just introduce you very briefly to the people I worked with in my PhD in northern Congo, the Bayaka. And when we worked with them in the 1993 to 97, the forest was teeming with animals. It was an extraordinarily beautiful place to inhabit. And it was a real privilege to spend time hunting and gathering, moving through that forest with them. But by 2000, this forest was being crisscrossed with roads made by logging companies going in to extract trees, and it really was transforming the forest in very damaging and negative ways for the people that we had come to know so well. And part of the problem was that although every inch of forest was attributed to one particular group or other, and people were very explicit and knew about these traditional territories, the government ignored it completely and just simply took the land for itself and then leased it for elite benefits, quite substantial benefits, to international logging companies to come and extract that timber. And there was a real sort of conflict of values here, because those trees were most valuable to local people standing in a particular time of year that they call the hunger season, when the rains have arrived. Animals disperse, it becomes very difficult to hunt. And so these Sapelli trees, these African mahogany trees, they give abundant caterpillars, and these caterpillars fall underneath the trees. Old people, children can collect them in large numbers, and they have a huge monetary value. They're sort of the tiger prawns of the forest. They're very sought after and delicious. And so people would sell them in local markets for 500 euros a sack. I mean, really very valuable item. On top of that, they have all sorts of medicinal properties. They're a sort of analgesic, a little bit like aspirin from willow bark, help people to deal with malaria and various other inflammations and body pains. And they're very, it's a wonderful timber, which is of course what attracts the outsiders to it. It's waterproof, it's insect proof, and it's very tough and resistant. But for the outsiders, of course, the value in the tree is when it's cut down and chopped into these blocks and exported. And this conflict of values is really based on the very different way that we know things. And it really struck me that this was a great tragedy, that this knowing that was so important to local people was completely ignored by the people meant to represent them, the government and the ministries. And so what happened in remarkably short amounts of time is lush areas of forest were suddenly transformed into these dusty sawmills with associated housing for workers. And the situation for local people was that they had all the worst jobs, you know, clearing the brambles on the side of the roads, and very, very tough, hard work, but not really of any real income. The elites, of course, were gaining a lot. But then in 2003, the logging company said they wanted to get Forest Stewardship Council a certification, which meant that they had to now start to deal with issues like free, prior, and informed consent. They had to make sure there were no conflicts between their resource extraction and local people's resource needs. And that's where they asked me to give them some advice. And we started off by mapping which resources local people needed. I went to local communities, asked them, well, how do you feel about loggers coming into your forest? And these are very egalitarian people. They operate on an economy of demand sharing. So if you have something that you can't immediately consume, anybody who passes by can just ask you for that thing, and you have to give it to them. It's not your right to say no, it's your obligation to give. And so when the loggers would ask for trees, they say, well, sure, there's loads of trees in this forest. Of course they can have some, it's not a problem. But there's some trees which we really, really value, which are really important for our livelihoods. The caterpillar trees, for instance. And so the only way of resolving the potential for conflict was to map them. And we started off doing it with the traditional GPSs, someone writing in a little notebook, waypoint 1 is this, waypoint 2 is that. And of course, there's huge amounts of human error that enter into that. And the hunter-gatherers were completely marginalized from the process. They had no idea what was really going on. They were just telling these people things, and they didn't understand it. So I asked a British company called Helveta, who were involved in supply chain software management software, that would they be able to make something with icons, and they agreed. And this was based on work my wife had been doing, using icons for medicine bottles so that non-literate healers could start to administer medicine safely using an iconographic way of describing how to do that. And so I applied this to the logging situation, and we developed this early software, pictorial software. But these gadgets, of course, cost over £1,000, and it made it all very difficult and elite. And so people would start going out and doing maps like this, and you can see the density on the right there, sorry, left, of their use of that forest. But even then, when the loggers extracted all the key resources they didn't want damaged during logging, they could still take out enough trees to make a profit, so they were happy. And suddenly these long discussions that had lasted for hours in the boardrooms of logging companies, where my hunter-gatherer friends felt really uncomfortable and very oppressed by the atmosphere and environment, suddenly didn't need to be happen. The maps could go there on their behalf. And this really made me awake to the power of maps as a visual representation to transcend the sorts of power dynamics that happen in face-to-face meetings in places like these logging companies' offices. And very soon, people were going out and marking the trees that were to be protected. And this was a very exciting time. So and this is when I met Muki, because as I was realizing that this had great potential, I started to write to people and nobody got it. Nobody understood what on earth I was on about. And then suddenly I wrote to Muki after talking to people at UCL, who on earth might understand this? And I said, try Muki. And immediately he got it. It was so refreshing. And not only that, he has an extremely good ability to persistently apply for money. And we tried and we failed, and we tried and we failed, as he explained. And then this challenging engineering grant came along. And Muki has just thought, extreme citizen science, that will do the trick. Oh, okay. And he introduced me to this whole concept of citizen science, which I was ignorant to before that. And suddenly I realized this natural coming together that we could put into extreme citizen science, from my experience working with non-literate people and his experience working with how to bring science to make it really accessible to people. We set this challenge, as you can see here, which Muki's also mentioned, but how actually would we materialize it? So a lot of the early work we did was actually trying to explore the extremes of geographic and digital literacy, some of the critiques that our previous project proposals have received from evaluators. And we found actually that, for instance, 300 meters above the land seems to be, if you take photographs of a landscape about that height, anyone can make sense of it. They can see individual trees, they can work out where they are, they can identify those places if they know them from living on the ground. We found that smartphones were actually very intuitive for most people, but we'd go into communities where they'd never touched a phone, they'd never seen a phone, they'd never even seen a digital screen. And very quickly, within just a matter of 20, 30 minutes, people were already starting to play around and figure out how these things worked. And so we then, of course, needed to make the interfaces which they were using more approachable, more appropriate to their ways of understanding representation. And so we would sometimes do the drawings ourselves. These are some beautiful ones that Jill did. Those leaves on the path are what people leave on paths to show you which way to go in the forest. And then if you've a path you shouldn't go down, they put a branch across it. And so that worked much better than a tick and a cross, which of course you need to have gone to school to understand. And then in some cases, this is a lovely one that Simon helped support, where the people drew their own icons. Here you've got births and deaths, because nobody ever registers their births and deaths, and this is really important to them. But next to it, you've got illegal alcohol breweries, which pollute these communities with drunkenness in the most appalling way. Illegal logging and poaching, their own farms and the animals that they see and so on. So people were deciding what they wanted to collect, what information was important to them. We also had some quite extreme technological challenges. How to send information, say, about a poaching camp in adequately quickly for action to be taken to control those poachers. And so Matthias bust his head creating an SMS transmission system so that we could send just on an SMS the information, the crucial information that was needed. But of course, we would also have to go and collect the images, and we had recordings so that people could actually tell you more information about what they had seen. But also electricity. This is a reverse electric blanket. So rather than produce heat, you cook your rice or spaghetti in the evening, and you charge your smartphone from that, the difference in heat attached to the handle. Very nice little device. So as we developed our relationships with local people, we discovered that it really was very feasible to democratize the process of designing software. So we could actually incorporate the local ontology into this software itself through the choices that people wish to take in their organization of the decisions that the software would represent. And on the right there, you can see a community actually designing a decision tree using the icons on squared pieces of paper and then arranging them in the logical way that would make sense for them to find that leaf at the end of the tree to take a point. On the top right, we have people experimenting with different ways of recording information about human rights abuses caused by conservation guards who would attack them essentially because they're very easy targets, not having political support outside. And we'd always spend a lot of time doing this, building this, well, firstly, asking people what the problems were in their local area. And if there were problems that we felt we might be able to address, then we'd begin a discussion. And if we could, if it did seem like something feasible, then we would talk about the pros and cons, the risks, the benefits that could emerge from that, and get into the collaborative research process if they gave their free, prior, informed consent. And it wasn't until all the community had tested the software, that would mean that women would take it out, men would take it out, young girls would take it out, young boys would take it out, and everyone would try and see, does it really address the things that I need? Do I understand these images? And where there were mistakes, we would start to try and address them. And this is an example, for instance, the people designing the non-literate hunter-gatherers designing anti-poaching software. Very sophisticated build, many, many decision trees. In fact, quite a complex process. Another example is this one of the relationship between local communities and logging companies. And this was perhaps one of the most complex bits of software that a community designed. In fact, it was so complex that people would often get lost in it, and it wasn't ideal. And as a result, Michalis, one of our researchers, developed Tap and Map as a way to try and see to what extent, if you just make the decision tree completely horizontal, so you just sort out cards, and here's someone just using it. So sorting the cards just in a horizontal way. Using near field communication, the phone takes the point just in another way. So we would experiment in these different ways to try and find what would work. And in fact, although we designed that, we never made it into a fully functional suite of software. But when we worked with the Maasai, much later, just a couple of years ago, they actually really preferred horizontal decision trees. And so we have this hugely complex, I think almost 100 decisions that they whizzed through in identifying which plants they wanted to record their medicinal plants, and they have an incredible knowledge of medicinal plants. So we're experimenting in very different ways of how to collect data. And then we also did quite extreme programming. And Matthias, I know, was one of the champions of extreme programming. Here we have Jill sitting in an elephant bath in the middle of the forest, redesigning human-wildlife conflict software that she'd been working on with the local community and the ecoguards in that place. Michalis and Julia quickly reprogramming the software as we bump along dusty roads, going from one community to the next. And then, of course, a very happy geographer seeing that the smartphone actually works to record the zero equator point. The problem of mapping satellite imagery for these areas, you've just got remote communities, there's no big commercial interest, so the satellite images are rubbish. So what to do? So Julia got a drone, Muki smashed the first one, but the second one she kept going and took it out to the forest, even getting arrested for being a spy at one point and having to make a few phone calls to get her busted out. But she persisted, and she took photographs of the local area around the community and then looked at how people understood those photographs by playing games with them, treasure hunts, to see if they could really understand the maps, and they could, of course, understand very well. So we started to really create this third space. Of course, there are still plenty of things we could do to improve it, and there, as Muki mentioned, lots of limitations built into the hardware and the software and the way that they operate. But we start with this community consultation and their participation in defining the problem, telling us what needs to be done. We then think about the risks and advantages and through addressing those and talking them through with the community, developing a free, prior, informed consent process that's supported by a community protocol, which determines who the data can be shared with, who's going to collect the data, when they're going to collect it, on what terms, and organizes the engagement of the community in the project. So we would then co-design these decision trees and the icons with the community, and people would start collecting data and then correcting and discussing that data among themselves or with our support. Then the big thing was to organize for advocacy. It's all very well collecting data, but how on earth do you make someone do something about it? How can we make sure the poachers are addressed, or that the ecoguards stop beating up innocent people? And so the relationships that we had to start developing were actually ended up for us as the excites people being a huge part of the job, trying to encourage police to take advantage of the information to act on it. For instance, one of our projects in the San community were all these cattle ranchers invading water holes meant for wild animals and ruining them, so the wild animals were scared away. And so the San wanted to take photographs of the ears of the cattle in order to be able to identify who they belonged to, give that information to the local police so that they could then say, look, sorry, you've got to not take your cattle to this place. But the police didn't care less. They were the best mates of the police. So that fell apart. And very often it was at that stage in trying to establish these networks of support that projects found, we found the greatest difficulty. But we found ways to overcome that, so that we'd have site visits between communities to try and enhance their advocacy messages, and also presenting the maps. In some of the very early projects on illegal logging, we were presenting maps to the guy who was getting the bakshish, getting the cash for allowing the illegal loggers in. And this became a perverse situation, great discomfort, of course, to the mappers. So we discovered that what we need to do is invite his boss to be present when the maps are shown to him. So if it's the local regional guy, you get the state level guy. If it's the national level, you get the funders. So always to try and have an oversight in the process of showing and sharing these maps. And that seemed to be much more effective. So as a result, we started to really develop a very explicit collaborative research agenda. Here, working with San in Nyai Conservancy, they said, we really want to be involved in the game count, which was done by the conservation organizations, so that we take more control over our conservancy. So we help them trying to work out different ways to get themselves much more involved in the game count. And as you can see in that poster, we've had extraordinary support from our co-collaborators. And really, this whole thing would not have been possible without the input, the critical input, the constructive input, and the imaginative input of all these communities right across the world, from Brazil through Cambodia, Central Africa, and Central African hunter-gatherers have been central, as Muki said, to many of our projects, and we really deserve a special thank you to them for their patience and continued faith in what we're trying to do. But also farmer communities there, farmers in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, the Nyaka in India and the Nilgiri Hills, Maasai, as you've seen, the San people, and then urban and rural communities in Lusaka as well. So a huge range of people from very different backgrounds have all found somewhere in this third space that they can represent their knowledge in ways that provides them with support for their whatever it is, the issues that they've recognized. So we've developed these basic practices now, which are the methodology of ECSAnVis. And Muki's talked a little bit more about the technologies. And there are great challenges. It takes time. These sorts of relationships aren't built in a day. You need to have trust. You need to build trust, work through trust. There's a certain technical support. We've now got an excellent technical partner, Natural Aptitude, who are very good at providing this. And developing long-term sustainable data collection solutions are difficult, or strategies. We've managed the logging example that I started with has been going since 2006. And the last time I checked, which admittedly was about 5 years ago, there were only twice that they'd cut down trees, Sapelli trees, which were important to communities, and they had made various amends to deal with that. But effective advocacy really is the current sticking point. There is so much big money involved in extractive industry. Governments get so many benefits from it. It really is a struggle to get local voices heard by those who are meant to be responsible for looking after these landscapes and looking after these people. And finally, it really does matter to local people to make maps. And this is Songe drying some wild pepper just a week or two before his whole camp was burnt down by ecoguards who claimed that he and his people who have been living in this area for literally hundreds of years were poachers and so couldn't be allowed to remain there. It really does make a difference. And so the extremes of extreme citizen science are in the people we work with, in our willingness to experiment, to try different things, and to go out and really build the relationships that allow a very different sort of software building and software programming. So thank you.
So Muki and Jerome have just given you a really cogent overview of the philosophical, political, anthropological, and geographical and other origins of extreme citizen science. And although the tools we use are represented up here on the timeline, they do have extraordinarily complex socio-technical contexts for their point of origin and a real commitment to inclusivity and empowering Indigenous and marginalized people in complex and quite vulnerable situations. So this is now kind of moving into showing very quickly what the actual tools are that people use in those situations to collect that data and then to visualize it. So Jerome gave a particular overview of Sapelli, what we call Sapelli collector in the team, which is data collection. But often all of that data flies into a black box that goes to NGOs, policymakers, and governments, and then hopefully may or may not do something. And one of those problems is it positions people as just data collectors without giving them a sense of control or ownership of the projects that they're involved in. So the ESCAnVis program that we're celebrating here today is about the visualization of that data by those same communities. So the majestic and highly pronounceable acronym ESCAnVis stands for Extreme Citizen Science Analysis and Visualization. Marvelous, I pulled that off without one slip. And as you can see from the timeline up there, we've had an introduction to Helvete, that kind of first prototype icon-driven that Jerome developed 15 years ago now, which is quite mad. I had just, I think, started my undergraduate degree there, completely insane to think about, which became Sapelli Collector, which then became Community Maps, which is a still living and existing piece of GIS visualization software used by one of our sister organizations, Mapping for Change, that does wonderful work in the global north, looking at things like air pollution and kind of citizen science, participatory approaches to that, but uses a lot of the same underpinning principles and technology as it cites. Sitting underneath that is a piece of software called Jacquie, which is a custom-built database that's what allows projects from multiple users to push their data into a single database and then visualize that using, as of the moment, or formerly, Community Maps. So some of our projects have used that kind of version 1 stack of technologies, but this program has been about producing and exploring ways in which Indigenous people can interact with their own data in the same smartphone. So they record data that they can go, aha, what have I seen? Brilliant, 10 deer by the watering hole. Oh wait, one of them got shot by a poacher. And then sharing that within the community without that reliance or need for sort of being totally anchored next to members of the team for minimizing that as much as possible. And supporting that, another tool called Sapelli Designer. You've seen shots of members of the team by watering hole frantically recoding XML. We designed a couple of years back a tool called Designer just to simplify that process. So there's an ongoing lifespan of these different tools as the work of ESCAnVis evolves. In the first instance, we were very grateful to the work that Matthias, Julia, and Patrick did in building Sapelli Collector, Community Maps, and Geographic. One of the perennial problems of research is people go on to do different things. You do a PhD, you find another job in industry, but unfortunately with that, when you have a very complex, smart, beautifully built piece of software, people take that knowledge with them when they go. And so the logo up there is for a tech partner we've been working with for the last 3 years, a lovely company called Natural Aptitude, the coder who has done a lot of the work building. Very much Joe for giving us all those lovely tools. And Matthias here has been on doing what we call technical contract management and procurement with bits of quasi-technical strategy. In the previous life, I was spent too much time lying with flowcharts and have used some of those skills to do something vaguely useful, where totally keeping excites to task and making sure that what they want is reflected in the technology that gets built. And yeah, Marcos will just give you a quick overview of what those actual bits of software that have been used in the field are, and a little bit of the story about his experiences and using them in the field. So that's my little preamble. Thank you all so much for coming and listening to us talk through this program. It's been a wonderful privilege to be a part of it for the last 4 or 5 years. And yeah, thank you all. Over to Marcos.
So I'm gonna go through this by doing a quick presentation, explaining how is the process, and then I'm gonna do an actual demo with all the technologies, okay? And hopefully all goes as planned. So that's the first technology we use actually. That's where everything is kind of drafted. And after that, that's where all the hundreds, I would say thousands of icons are created. Sometimes are drawn, sometimes are pictures that are downloaded, sometimes edited, many different types of icons. We don't have time to go over all of it. And now this one example, that's the output. Okay, we'll come to this later, but just to have an idea how it looks like. This is actually the project from Kenya, Maasai Sound in Kenya. So we'll create this project from scratch to see how the process is. Okay, and that's after paper and drawing icons or downloading the images. That's how it starts. As Dan was saying previously, that was done by XML coding, and in 2019, Sapelli designer came. The output of Sapelli designer is a zip file or a ZAP file that then it goes into Sapelli collector, the tool that has been shown in the previous slides. And after that, when the data is collected, it has multiple paths. One of them is it can be exported locally, or it can be transmitted to the server. Also the SMS functionality, which is not included here. And once here in the GeoKit, which provides the server-side components for it, then in terms of visualization, it has 2 different paths: community maps, actually Sapelli View first, which pull the data from Sapelli collector and soon from the server, and then the other one is community maps. Okay, so community maps also offer mobile visualization, but it needs to be connected to the internet, whereas Sapelli Viewer works offline. Okay, and now we're gonna do the demo. So this is how Sapelli Designer looks like. It's a progressive web app, so it's basically a web app that can work offline and can be installed in the device. And if you recall the first screen of the Sapelli project, when you click here, that's where you get the chance to start populating the icons. Okay. In that case, as Jerome was mentioning, it was perhaps the project that combine more icons in one single sprint. So not following a decision tree structure, but just dropping all the icons, in this case, plants that were identified by the Maasais. Okay. So in this case, obviously, I'm not gonna go and add all the 100 plants, but that's how it works. So these are the images that were taken by the Maasais. Like that was quite challenging to identify which image best identify the plant. Okay. And then that's it. You just add the image here, then provide the value, and I think this goes on 134 plants. Okay, so we're not going to do that. And then
300 in the last count.
134 in one location, and then in the mouth for it was 150 or something. So in total 300, but this one was 100. With the identifying what, half an hour? Yeah. And then the next screen, if you can recall from the Sapelli project, allows the user to say which risks affect this plant. So it can be a pest or deforestation, elephants, So that's where you got you got to define the second type of icons. Okay, in this case, for instance, this one. Whoops. Yeah. Okay, and again, you just keep adding values to this. Then usually in all the projects there are three common elements, which is taking a picture. Okay, the other one is often audio recording, and then the last one, which is almost always there, is the location. Okay, there are, as here on the right hand side, there are many other functionalities that are taken from the Sapelli documentation. We're not going to go into this, but if we export the file as default, the Sapelli project works. You can keep adding complexity, and then this is how the final project looks like. Okay. If you notice here, before I was using the browser, but this is the same app that is being installed in the computer. Okay, and that's how it looks like. So it's a rather big project with many icons. Okay, so these first ones are all the plans, and that's what we are seeing about the risk associated to each plan. Okay, so a very small decision tree structure with just 2 levels, and the last option is sending the data or canceling and starting again. Once this is done, this is kind of packed in a zip file that contains all the structure in an XML file, and then a folder with all the images. And if there's audio, instructions and other type of file that can be included there. So with this file, now we move to the phone. This is the zip file, which can also be used with the extension of as a sub file. But, yeah. So then let's imagine that we have just loaded this zip file into the phone. Then you browse the file here, just find the sub file, and then the project is automatically loaded. In order to avoid dealing with this screen, which contains text, then there is the option of adding a shortcut. So then the user can immediately launch the Sapelli project that we just created without dealing with the main interface of Sapelli collector. Okay, and here these are the 134 plants that they identified. And after that, there's a second screen that we mentioned, just to zoom in and allow the user, the participants, to see is it really the plant that they want to map or not. If not, it's just going back. Okay. And then just to confirm the selection, and then describing what is the risk associated to this plant. Okay, instead we can do charcoal, taking the picture, then audio recording. Yeah. And then, well, this is not going to happen now. We're not going to wait until the location. We are inside. Okay, but that's the process of mapping using Sapelli collector. Okay, so far this. Okay, so create the Sapelli project, load it into collector, and then collect some data points. If we imagine that this data point has been transmitted to the server, that's how the data looks like in community maps. Okay, just to show some examples. Okay, and then if you select a point, then you get all the attributes on the left, and here showing the same icon that is used in the Sapelli project. Okay, and the last element of visualization is, again, going back to the phone. And for this, you don't need internet connection. It automatically identifies so basically it communicates with Sapelli collector. Now the plans are to bring both apps into one. okay, but we are not at that stage yet. Here you can see imagine that point that I just created is added here. So if we keep zooming in, we will get into where we are now. Okay. Yeah. Then these are just some sample points that we added for the demonstration. Okay. And again, the icons used for that are exactly the same as the icons that are used in the Sapelli project in Collect. Okay. Then, in terms of the functionalities, starting from the top right, there is first the filtering. Okay, so there's two ways of filtering. We're going to stick to the basic ones. So let's say we only want to select the orange proton, if it was the name of this plant, and then apply the filters. Then there's no data. Okay, so clearing the filter, then we see again the contributions. Okay. The other button, starting from the top, is time filtering. Okay, so in this case, that was quite challenging to see how we can represent time using toggle interfaces. First one, it's last day, last month, last season, but we'll see later, and this changes depending on the context. Okay, so in this case, yeah, filtering because that was created yesterday, so it wants the filter won't apply. If it was created a month ago, then that point is at you. Okay, and the last functionality here at the top is, as you see before, there was like two main aspects in the project: the plant and the risk associated to each plant. Okay, so in this case, we are seeing the photos of the plant. Okay, if we click on this icon, the tree, it shifts to the other attributes. Okay, and it just keeps changing. In this case, there were only two aspects in this Sapelli project. So we click back, the same image appear again. Okay. In terms of the icons at the bottom, this one is for changing the base map. So in this case, we're using satellite imagery. Now we are online, so we have the whole wall covered. But if we were offline, then there is a way to load map tiles, so it can be used offline. Okay. Obviously, the size of the area that can be covered is limited, but yeah, we've been testing it. It works, not for extremely large areas, but yeah. So in this case, there is only two positions: online base map, satellite imagery, and then the other one is OpenStreet map base map. The other functionality below this one is map rotation. Okay, which is proven valuable in some contexts. In other contexts, it's just by turning. It works. Okay, and this is just to reorient to north. We had some discussion on what should be the default orientation of the map. Then we concluded that it should be north. There is the possibility of modifying these things. We'll see later. And then the last one is recentering to the GPS location. Okay, so in this case, we need to go back to London. Okay, yeah, and then the map, the rotation of the device. Okay, so these are the actually I forgot this one. The information that is shown when a data point is selected. Okay, so as we see here, only two aspects, but there are other Sapelli that have many other information here. In this case are the icons. In case there is text, in some cases, Sapelli project allows to input information using text. If a picture was taken, it will be shown here, and the same for audio recording. Okay, and that's all the attribute information that can be captured with Sapelli Collector. Then to finalize, because Sapelli Collector allows for a high level of customization, so we try to bring this concept also to Sapelli viewer, but that's quite more challenging because you got a lot more complexity in terms of map design. So there is this functionality that's let's say only available for admin users or experienced users, okay, that can change some of the settings of the map interface, not only the icons. So for instance, the icon for a base map or the icon for recentering the GPS can be modified as well. And then again, like map orientation by default, in some cases the map orientation should be east, for instance, but because all the maps are currently pointing north, we just keep north as default. And that's, I mean, we're not going to go through all these functionalities. So that was it.
So it's really great that we have on the panel now, in addition to Jerome, which already introduced, Comandulli, who's done some of the early work within the Citizen Science Project, Matthias, who is responsible for the original version of Sapelli. So we'll start with a question of we talked about the role of technology and social activities within the project. So what is your view about the balance of technology and the way that it operates in the type of project that we're talking about?
Thank you, Muki, and thank you so much for being here. I'm so happy to see so many familiar faces and to hear the history of, our research group and this exchange, interdisciplinary exchange is great. Yeah, well, in terms of the, I would say the role of the technology in this setting is really to bridge gaps, communication gaps between societies which are outside our context and can be shown, like what they are doing can be seen in our society. But still, as we are from the early stages of this process, we had to overcome a lot of challenges in terms of dealing with the technology and, making it accessible and understanding what was not so easy to be accessed and to be dealt with. So in that sense, the technology, for example, the use of the equipment, the maintenance of equipment, in my case, which was used in the jungle, in very humid areas, that was really a big challenge, a big limitation. But we've been working ways of overcoming this, and I'm very happy to see how far this has gone. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to repeat a word of thanks. It's fantastic to be here to hear the story looking back on 10 years or more. I got involved 10 years and a few months ago, and worked in the office just about here for 4 years. A lovely time. And well, the role of technology, as I was the first, maybe second computer scientist to join. Well, obviously, it was quite central to the story already in the papers that had been written before by Jerome. There was quite a lot of optimism also about the potential of technology, some of which was somehow sometimes reality checked in challenging ways. I think the story of the decision trees working in some scenarios, but sometimes getting too complex in let's say the need to kind of understand hierarchical reasoning compressed on a small screen where you can't really see the full decision space turned out to be harder for some communities than we had built. Harder than initial optimism informed. But we stayed resourceful. I think the story of Tap and Nap, which was in the talk before, shows that we just found out that the plastic cards we were actually only carrying to explain the images where could themselves become the interface, right? Instead of doing it on a small LCD screen, which I always remembered as yeah, a very good example of thinking outside of the box on our part, but also being informed by seeing the people use those cards and noticing that this actually works much better than whatever we're trying on the small screen. So that, I think, is a good example of keeping an open mind even towards solutions we by that time really believed in, and that we may need to tweak it. And that speaks to how, I guess, technology always needs to be challenged and tweaked to meet needs and rechecked as well.
Yeah, and I mean, just to emphasize that on what Matthias was saying, that technology is nothing without the social relationships in which it's embedded. And a huge amount of work, which is all invisible actually on these things, is spent in endless meetings with local officials, with other people who might be able to act in favor of the communities. And it is just tiresome, frankly, to do all that, but it's absolutely necessary if you want to have any success from the use of these technologies. And while I think we've developed a pretty effective suite of technologies to collect information, what we do with information is the crucial part, and that's of course where those networks, those relationships will come into play. And it remains perhaps the greatest challenge actually of this kind of work.
Thank you. So the next question is that we received this funding, and the European Research Council is especially highlighting the importance of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. So those are kind of not familiar. Interdisciplinary is when different disciplines are coming together to create new knowledge. And transdisciplinary got different definition, but a lot of time it's when there is either participation with civil society and other actors outside academia to create together new forms of knowledge and new ways of solving and addressing problems. And those two things are being prized. But what kind of your experiences in dealing with boundaries, either of whatever kind you want to discuss, and how it was negotiated?
Yeah, well, again, of course, I will go back to my case with this indigenous community in the Amazon. And, in terms of negotiating boundaries, a key one that happened, really as I arrived, is about building trust. So it's like, understanding, it is related to the culture itself. So whenever you get into, a setting where we are not so used to, and we are bringing something from the outside, understanding or being very respectful to the culture, because at the beginning of my field work, like I wouldn't even receive any, nobody would talk to me, wouldn't look at me, they would just be very reserved, and that was the boundary to start, but which can be really overcome with respect and observation and patience, right? So I would just highlight that one.
Yeah, for me working here, and I imagine for other people that John sits, the interdisciplinary foundation of research projects and of the group was truly enriching. Working with anthropologists like Jerome, Jill, Carolina, learning about anthropology in its different varieties. First meeting someone like Jerome, then Jerome taking me to the radical anthropology group, where I met some other kinds of anthropologists, which was an eye-opener in many ways for me. Learning about the value of core concepts of anthropology like participant observership, but also its challenges, and yeah, somehow floating around that as a computer scientist trying to make use of software. Also learning quite a lot about that, and maybe not to do it in some cases. I learned a lot of lessons about social engineering and how to approach it in an iterative, team-driven way. And these lessons, maybe unfortunately, I learned mostly in the jobs I've done after leaving UCL. If I could turn back time, I might have applied those things over here. May have effect, may have some positive effects. But yeah, it was a place, and I believe it still is, where the boundaries of disciplines are maybe not always invisible, but are a great value rather than really a boundary, right? Within the group. And at the very least, interesting discussions and the, let's say, to end with a cliche, the sum is greater than the parts. Right? That excites, and I really love that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I've appreciated particularly is the way that those boundaries force you to be elastic. They force you to not judge too quickly, to wait and see, to stick one foot in tentatively at first, and then, okay, it's a bit complicated, all this stuff. And slowly, with people like Matthias and Muki to help guide me around, I mean, if I had tried to be in charge of this technological development by myself, it'd be nowhere. It would have been a disaster. And slowly understanding the depth and the perspective and the ways that things need to be done in different disciplines, I found really enriching. And it's that stretching, which is something very stimulating. It's hard while you're doing it, but afterwards you just feel really something great has you've witnessed and you've started to understand. And that really is a great gift of these transdisciplinary approaches.
So I'll respond also for that question, because that question is actually one that interests me before we put the last question. That within the whole issue of boundary is really interesting as citizen science. As I got more and more into it, it's actually busting boundaries all over the place. And it's really interesting how within every discipline that gets citizen science, when you look carefully into what citizen science can do to the discipline, it can break the boundaries inside. So, for example, one of the classic examples is in medical research. And one of the people that I admire is Sarah Wagner from Sweden, who is a Parkinson disease sufferer who basically done experiment on herself to control her situation. And she's doing it so well that she's instructing her doctors about how to do the research. But she then started writing a PhD on it, and at some point it was rejected because she didn't have an ethics application on doing the experiments, which means that's a kind of, I mean, she sorted it and she's now a doctor, which is fantastic. And she's really doing that. Her work is really amazing. But the point about it is that it's busting a boundary. It's actually this whole assumption about medicine, about doing someone of other things are just being broken all over the place. And it's really interesting to see how science as an entity is negotiating it. And it also explains some of the resistance the citizen science experience in this area. So the final question. Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to say, from a legal perspective, please do not omit in your analysis the incredible value of this work to those of us who are lawyers trying to do some work in this area, because there are so many areas of cross-pollination. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
It's okay.
What I wanted to say was, I mean, I first became aware of this as a consequence of my director's work and my friendship with Eleanor Jane Milner-Dunham at Oxford, and she said, "You need to know about this." And Isabel and I have been secretly discussing the fact that there's a community that we're trying to look after at the moment who's about to be evicted in their land. And the really interesting thing is to try and work out what they're going to lose. And if we could in some way or another incorporate some of the extraordinary magical work that's being done here in a deeper understanding of what they are likely to lose, instead of just this, laundry list of things that they'll get a bit of compensation for. But you could actually talk about the caterpillar tree as it exists for them, for example. It would be utterly invaluable to those of us who are doing this kind of work on land rights, forestry, law rights, and the whole lot. I'm just putting it out there and saying, help, please.
Thank you. So, final question for the panel is one lesson that you're taking from the work that you see. One, no,
Yeah,
whichever.
I already alluded to it before, so maybe I should have kept it.
You can use it. Reuse.
Well, a lot of effort, a lot of software engineering effort was spent on things that were technically quite complicated to do as a mostly individual developer, which in the end, for various reasons, and I'm talking specifically about transmission of data via SMS, we kind of got caught up with reality that, as I understand, never really was used quite a lot. It was? Okay, very good. Because I know it's no longer in Sapelli now. But yeah, a big lesson is to iterate more quickly on things and eventually add all functionality, whereas I think I was too much of a perfectionist back then. I no longer am. The teams I lead now, we do things essentially. When I meet people that are very perfectionist, I get cautious. They need the right guidance.
Yeah, well, thinking again back to the community, work with communities, I would say within this extreme system science process, really the free prior informed consent, this is, really, really important. And it's not just something to do at the beginning, but, to do it until all throughout the time of the project development, because there are lots of nuances and a lot of things that evolve through the process of setting up an application, collecting data, using the data, making agreements. And, this constant update and double checking is really important.
Yeah, I mean, there are a huge number of things I've learned, but I think the one thing perhaps which is very good to share is that persistence pays. You've got to keep at it. Don't give up. Literally, when it comes to funding software, persistence pays.
Thank you very much. And we have one question from the audience. We shall open to anyone from the group. So just raise your hand if you want to answer it. Have you used your tools for mapping human experience and interaction rather than external happening, particularly with other sensors? Having participants talk about new users of Sapelli. So the first one, I think that there was the Indigenous, maybe there was something, or some other.
I mean, they're
using
their noses as their sensors.
Yeah, so there is a project of Mapping for Change that is using nose as sensors. Chris Arnold, who was member of the group, was doing his emotional mapping back in 2007. And for the last question, the second part of the question about the new application of Sapelli, that was absolutely the case, and Simon is going to actually might mention it, but what we have shown demonstration, the communities were coming to us, and that's actually the original inspiration, because Jerome told me, one of the early stories that Jerome told me about is from the harassment of the ecoguard, that after the data collection by the community around resources, the community said, hey, we want this thing, but now for ecoguard. So any community can come with request, and that was demonstrated. So thank you very much for the panel.
So my name is Fabien Moustard, and I will briefly introduce my research on recognition the recognition gap between indigenous people and the ecoguards in the Congo Basin. I'm a PhD candidate working under the supervision of Muki Haklay and Jerome, and I've been working mostly in Cameroon and Congo. And I've been acting in the context of conservation of biodiversity and ecosystems, but a very specific one called forest conservation. So it's a very specific way of protecting biodiversity by separating ecosystem from the original inhabitants, namely the indigenous people. And of course, when you extract people from the ancestral lands, that come along with a lot of violence. The soldiers named the ecoguards are in charge of removing these people from the forest or keeping them away from the forest. So there is importantly many rights, human rights abuses. And so now the global political conservation are moving towards 30% of protected areas by 2030. And of course, if we continue to conduct this kind of conservation, that will bring even more violence. And a good example of that is when you go to Cameroon or to Congo with Baka people. They do not live in the forest anymore. And they live around the road, along the road, and in extreme poverty. And they will describe themselves as non-existent people, as people who do not matter, who do not belong, and who are not worthy. And on the other side, you have the ecoguards who are officially recognized as the one in charge of the protection of forests. So they will mostly patrol in the forest with AK-47 to arrest the poachers and to address illegal wild crimes. So there is therefore a huge recognition gap between indigenous people and the ecoguards. Recognition gap are defined as disparities in wealth and cultural membership between different groups in a society. And so the idea in this context was to use to bring this hypothesis to say that Sapelli can be used by indigenous people to address the recognition gap between them and the ecoguards. Why is that possible? Because the Baka people still have the best knowledge of the forest. They go in the forest to hunt, they go in the forest to gather some food, like honey, you can see the pictures, or the woman will go to fish. So they know what is going on in the forest. And Sapelli enabled them to materialize the knowledge, to make the knowledge accessible and useful for conservation. So on the right side, you can see a project that they designed with the ecoguards. And of course, the guards are looking for such data. They really want to know where are the poachers, where are the animals that they want to protect. And so the question now is really about can ecoguards start collaborating with indigenous people in conservation? And you can send pictures that such collaboration has started. So to conclude, very briefly, the Sapelli digital tool supports the recognition of the key role of indigenous people in protecting forests. And you can see in these pictures for the first time ever, Baka people going in the forest together with the ecoguards, thanks to the Sapelli project. Thank you very much.
Okay. So I'm Moreu. I'm going to talk about land generated maps, and so the big data hub in the digital earth, a bit more from a technical perspective. And yeah, thanks to Muki and Jerome for making today. First, acknowledgement to all of you here. Those that are not here, there's a nice picture from Vincent in who left us 3 months ago, and those that couldn't make it today here. Yeah, and then so 5 minutes doesn't allow too much. So I'm going to briefly talk about the problem that we try to address the social technical approach and innovation somehow, and then the lessons that we learn and the results in these 5 locations, focusing on Ethiopia and Nigeria. That's what we spend more time. So the problem is that the airland surface is increasingly being mapped by sensors and machines, but not by those who use the land. So if land users are not part of the mapping process, it's fundamentally impossible to understand land use or human interaction, I would call it. So the data gap is huge, okay, and this has implications not only on the land use knowledge but also on the security of land rights. It's actually estimated that 70% of the people-to-land relationships are not recorded worldwide, especially in developing countries. So the challenge that we trying to address is to enable land user generated maps. So the land use planning related decisions are not based only on the data that you see on the top left and the data that you see on the top right and other authoritative maps that you can that are available in some areas. So to do that, we focus on democratizing the production and use of geographic information, but that's not enough. So there needs to be like collaboration on democratizing actually the access to satellite imagery and access to relevant information for climate adaptation. And the way we trying to do it is by trying to bring mapping to where people communicate not only in the cultural dimension, following what Sapelli does, but also in the physical dimension and also in the digital dimension. Okay, and we started detecting this. Well, here you can see. So in addition to the GPS functionality for creating a geometry, Sapelli for describing it, and then Jacquie and Community Branch for sharing it privately with the Spot database. In Namibia, with Megan and Steve, we started testing 2 additional functionalities. The one is on the left, the offsite mapping using satellite imagery, so people can map not only when they're in the field, but also when they gather and share and connect. Okay, and then the other one is sharing data. In this case, we link it mapping to messaging, exploiting the potential of WhatsApp. Okay, this was invented in the 13th in Nigeria because we realized that farmers were less interested in mapping, but more on getting farming advice. So WhatsApp was more important than actually creating maps. And I mean, we had many challenges, but yeah, and this is how it looked like. So creating a geometry, describing it with the Sapelli protocol that we co-designed, sharing the data through WhatsApp, and then we kind of prototype this special decision super system to show decision maker how this information could look like. Okay, kind of aggregating information saying in this area there are X vectors. And then the other one where this technology has been used is in South Ethiopia by Nyangata agropastoralists who are mapping their resources for participatory resource management, but also for land rights issues that will arise or are already there, and also for the security crisis. And then on the left, you can see the Sapelli project in Ethiopia at the center of the map that has been created so far. And you can see here the many semantic and special challenges. But it's a fantastic map. It's still uncertain what are going to be the impacts of this, but it's already there. So as you can see here, this is the comparison. And what we're trying to do now is see how we can collaborate to bring these 3 worlds together. So we can put at the center the map that you can see at the bottom, which is often missing in all these environmental management systems. But we're still at the process, and yeah.
All right, let's crack on. I'm Simon Hoyte. I'm finishing my PhD in the ECSAnVis group, and I've been working in Cameroon with mostly Baka hunter-gatherers, as you can see here. Yes, so I'm kind of cheating because I'm going to show you a video in a second, which is a testimony by my longtime friend and collaborator, Samuel Lebo, who used to work for ZSL, the Zoological Society of London, who I've been collaborating with. He will explain what it's like on the ground to work with any community anywhere, in this case, very extreme environments.
It's been a great wealth of experience working on the Sapelli project in the southeast Cameroon. We happen to work in 6 communities. This is since 16 through 2022. And these communities were mainly grouped into two, the Baka, hunters and gatherer, and also the Bantu forest community. And to our amazement, it was very interesting to see how much both communities could embrace new technology as far as conservation issues are concerned, and how much they were prepared already to engage in this task, which was seemingly very difficult considering the fact that the majority had never used a smartphone before and needed to do so in this project. And to our surprise, they picked up very fast. And in a short while, we started receiving data coming from the different communities. And most remarkably, Bakas were outstanding in their report compared to Bantus, although both were reporting. And it is also worth noticing that the reports were very useful. I remember concerning ivories that were got reported around the June, and we were able to rally effort and see these ivories from being smuggled out. And a lot of others, we had different kind of data that came up from the communities. And one of the challenging aspects of the project was being able to take action. Was kind of slowness in the effort of law enforcement, and also challenges with network sometimes because information could reach late and would also delay action in the field. But away from this, I think it was really amazing to see how much indigenous communities could buy the idea and engage into, and we could borrow from the original knowledge of conservation since they have been living there for ages. We got to understand what they have been doing, and we are learning from their process. And with this, we think conservation is taking a new phase, starting from the very bottom, from the very people who are concerned and who live by it. And we think if we keep up this way, it will be very rewarding at the end. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hannah. Thanks for being here in person. Thanks for joining online. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that me and our colleague Artus, who can't be here at the moment, do in terms of testing some of this technology remotely with some of our local partners around the world. So if you don't know what human-computer interaction is, you don't know what usability is, I'm going to try and really briefly introduce you to it. Basically, it's the idea that we use to describe how easy it is for someone to use a specific device to undertake a specific task in a specific context in order to fulfill a specific goal. So it's quite precise, but it's really essential, particularly when we're talking about using Sapelli viewer, particularly on mobile devices and their applications. And in this context, trying to assess how usable Sapelli viewer is in a specific context. So we've worked with a lot of people to do a lot of experiments, which we call usability testing. As a general principle, usability testing involves us testing a product with representative users or exact users in the field. We undertake a set of representative tasks supervised by a researcher or a local assistant in this context, and we observe what people do. Ultimately, we try and identify the kind of problems that people might have specifically with the device. We undertook a series of testing this year, which was remote because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is the kind of materials we produced, materials we produced, which Megan might discuss a bit more with you. We produce these because ultimately we need to follow a protocol to try and mitigate any kind of relationships that a user or a representative user or a researcher might have with that person. Here's some example footage that we've got of people doing it this year, and I'll show you some more footage later on. Essentially, we worked with a series of people and training them to be able to undertake these experiments to work out how viewer might be redesigned to work better for specific people. So when we were doing that, we had the devices in the field with a series of communities and a series of people. And we ended up getting quite a lot of diverse feedback from these different groups because the people who were undertaking these kind of experiments understood the local context really, really well. So we had people giving very intimate experiences, very intimate descriptions of what they found difficult, what they found interesting, what they found useful. Some people really liked being able to share information, for example, about resource locations in Brazil. Some people really found it difficult to look at forests from above that we had in Congo Basin. So it's quite interesting information that people were able to collect in these contexts. The reason I find this interesting, beyond it being my job, is because it really helps you to understand how people think and how they feel about the technology. And for me, when we're undertaking this kind of work, we sort of assert and we promote and validate the different systems of knowledge that we work with, which I think is really useful, particularly because when we're working with people in this context, we work in these sort of anti-colonial contexts, and a lot of the time we're coming from a set of ideas and a set of resources that specifically do not seek to decolonize anything. So I'm kind of interested in the idea whether this egalitarian co-production is anti-colonial. For me, I think it could be because we have all these different ways, and I'm going to kind of explore them with you very, very briefly, because as you know, it goes real quick here. But in terms of trying to produce this sort of transformative praxis, we base it on this idea that anti-colonial science produces, and it's produced by this ethical responsibility that researchers have to undertake research which is comprehend sort of intangible and tangible values, and particularly in the face of critical environmental loss that some of my colleagues have been talking about, and community need able to actually record these values. So when we think about anti-colonial science, as many people, some of you might know this person, she's really great. It basically seeks to deconstruct and dismantle the structures which replicate colonial legacies. Within scientific research and practice and policy, within our usability testing, this approach sort of aims to address the disconnect that Indigenous people have frequently had when they haven't been able to engage in this kind of thing. And our remote co-production with our local partners considers their relevant aims to their community, and it hasn't really achieved the decolonizing of the process, but it has aimed to dismantle the structures of colonialism which have been conventionally present in the usability testing process. So thank you very much for this brief introduction.
Hi everyone, my name is Megan and I'm a research assistant here at ESCAnVis. Part of my role since last May has been to do some training materials to teach people how to use Sapelli. So as Hannah alluded to, with the constraints placed on us by COVID and travel, we did a lot of work last year through local assistants who could facilitate some of our research, and this gave us a good opportunity not only to discover more about how the products we have are viewed, but also to create training materials that we can then test and hopefully use elsewhere. So when I first joined the site, you've seen the slide from Muki already, this is how the website still looks. Most of the tutorials were predominantly intended for people with a high level of digital literacy, and our researchers would sort of use these to train people, but they weren't necessarily useful for anyone who didn't have this kind of XML level of digital literacy or digital confidence. So while this is really useful for understanding troubleshooting and how projects are constructed, with the advent of Sapelli Designer, which you saw Marcus give a demonstration earlier, we realised that actually we could make some new training materials to kind of show how this works. And this, the idea of this is just to try and make sure that more people can access the use of any tools. So I set about documenting the process of designing a project from scratch using all of the Sapelli tools. Firstly, I had to identify who our audience were, the local assistants we had. Most of them had an internet connection, although it wasn't necessarily particularly stable, and they also needed to have access to some kind of mobile device and an internet browser. So all of our training materials are meant for people with this level of access. Obviously, in the future, we might want to try and go further. And we kind of spoke to lots of different local assistants about what would be useful and look at the constraints that are placed on them. So recognising that people would learn in different ways, we combined text, which you can see on the left, sort of standard text tutorials with images, and also video tutorials, and I'll show some of those in a minute. The considerations we had were they needed to be short, mostly for ease of use, but also a lot of people would need to download them, so we didn't want the data costs to be high, and they needed to work on a range of devices. so that, yeah, a lot of different people could use just what they already had to access the materials. So what you now can see on the website is a list of sort of easily navigable text and video tutorials. It helps the users to self-direct their learning, so most of our assistants undertook self-directed learning to figure out how to use the tools with input from us as and when was needed, and we're hoping that this will mean that people can go through and use it. And then we had quizzes to check their understanding and to get feedback. And one of the things I'd really like to say is a huge acknowledgement to all the local assistants who provided feedback for us, because that was really helpful to get the training materials to a point where hopefully more people can use them. So I'm just going to show you a few examples of the training materials. This is obviously sped up. It does not exist this fast in reality, but I started some of them. We wanted to show that you didn't need a huge amount of technology to get started. So this is how you draw a wireframe. You will see a similar image in Marcus's presentation before. And then, so again, similar to the way Marcus demonstrated earlier, I screen recorded how you go about setting up a project through Sapelli Designer. You can see adding images in this case and how you go through and do that. And then I used a run through the mobile device, so again, this is sped up, but how we go about collecting data using a mobile device. I developed this bird project because I hope that it would be quite relatable for a lot of people who kind of want to collect similar environmental data. So that was to show how that would look, and then finally how Sapelli Viewer operates, and the way, as you also seen earlier, how all the data appears on Sapelli Viewer. This is, I think, real speed. Yeah, so just next steps. Well, next steps were to make tutorials visible and Sapelli.org, but I did that this afternoon. So if you want to go and figure it out yourself, you can. It's all under the tutorials tab. And if you have any feedback for us and anything you want to say, then please do get in touch. Because I'd be delighted to hear what your input for one of the materials. So digital technology in the jungle, a case study with the Ashaninka people in the Brazilian Amazon. Carolina Comandulli and a PhD. Well, I'm already a PhD in anthropology after many years, and I was, next science supervised by Jerome and Muki. My study site was precisely Brazilian Amazon with the Ashaninka people. Where you see a picture there, that little triangle in the border to Peru. And the Ashaninka people are about 100,000 people in the Brazilian and Peruvian Amazon. And this community had about like 1,000 dwellers, very little connectivity, electricity, but excites made it possible for me to carry out my research there, as it provided a practical application to a concrete problem they were facing. So the Ashaninka, they have titled their land in 1999, expelling loggers, and since then they've been fighting invasions in their territory, trying to call out authorities and denounce the invasions. And they thought that what Sapelli could offer would provide them with more evidence, and more readily evidence for them to pressure the authorities. So I did a process of requiring informed consent, explained about the possibilities of Sapelli and extreme citizen science methodology, and they chose that they wanted to monitor invasions in their territory. And so we worked together on types of indicators, which type of invasions, and we built prototype, and we reviewed the prototype, and we went through a series of training sessions over like a 6-month period, adapting it together and doing, hypothetical and practical exercises to implement it. And the group of monitors was about 13 people, and the man, well, just one woman, the rest were men, some literate, some illiterate, and many of them have never used a smartphone before. So we went through this process of just making it as best as possible for their use and as suited to their reality. And we did lots of, expeditions together and planning. So you can see the shape of their land and, some mapping exercises over there. now I have plenty of time, just not say anything. Yeah, so, and at the end, we did a community protocol meeting after like 6 months of setting up the project, where we built the agreements related to running the project after the prototype was strong. So who's going to do it, who's responsible for what, how we share data, how is the technical support, and so on and so forth. So that was like, a very big official event to make the agreements around it, including other organizations that partner with them. And then after that, we continued doing expeditions. We produced maps together to show to the government, that this was like a real expedition for an invasion. And, I continued training them on like how to use equipment in the jungle, digital technology in the jungle, because this was one of the findings of my research. It's like Sapelli worked pretty well. They didn't have much difficulty navigating, collecting data, but at the same time, you have to deal with a lot of pieces. If for a mobile phone, you need to charge it, you need to software updates, you need the memory card, you need to export data. And sometimes these pieces, if you lose a cable, you cannot charge it anymore. And in the jungle, you don't have a shop nearby. So, and the humidity and all of these challenges related to the packaging are very important to pay attention to. And the other thing is like quick visualization is really, I'm very glad to see the viewer, because this is something really that makes people, stimulate people to continue using, the technology and the resource. So at that time we didn't have that, but precisely this research was to send feedback to London, and then this has been improved since then. That was, I started in 2015 in the field, 2014 with ECSAnVis, and I left in 2017. So yeah. Thank you so much.
So that's one way to deal with pressure. I didn't tell them actually. Anyway. I thought that it's a good experience anyway. It's all learning. It's all learning. So where are we going from that? So now that we got the viewer and we demonstrated what we wanted to do from the start, it's feeling that part of the research, there's things that can be done within the research environment, kind of things, how new technology, how machine learning, how AI, how other things that are coming along can be integrated. And that could be part of the research. But there is, of course, also huge opportunities of using this technology now in the field. So we got all the material and we prepared the material in such a way that other people can use it. We now have 20 examples. It's not something that Jerome and I kind of had, and someone can tell us, what evidence do you have? So now we do have the evidence. I almost wanted to write to the person and said, we do this 11 years, but we have the evidence, 15 years, sorry, but we have the evidence. So that evidence hopefully will help us to kind of start getting different people to support this work. There is a long way to go, actually. And it's a very expensive way to go because it's required software and the development of it and the development of the devices and continue to adapt things. But there is a potential here. It's demonstrated that with very simple technology, notice that throughout what you've seen, you haven't seen any kind of cutting edge AR or virtual reality or anything like that. It's standard smartphones that were available in 2011 and are still available today, and you can use this stuff. Things that really change are things like infrastructure, the ability to communicate in the forest all the way through, and that made huge difference for us, and no idea what's going on. And all these pictures, by the way, every single one of them is coming from the blog of ECSAnVis, so that's another reason. One principle that they have in the group is that everyone can come back from the field by the blog post. So, interesting. But it's actually was really good exercise to share the knowledge, and ECSAnVis is something that continue to share the knowledge throughout. So that's kind of one part of the job, that this journey will continue to grow, and there is a huge enthusiasm within the project students that are involving to develop it further. And I do hope that this technology and the things that we learn from ESCAnVis and from other areas will help. Looking back to where I started, I've actually been just 2 weeks ago. So I've done my own journey from being a student looking at the Aarhus Convention to actually sitting in the room where the UN Economic Commission for Europe having the annual meeting, the meeting of parties of the Aarhus Convention, and being there as a representative of the European Citizen Science Association. And we just 2 weeks ago, the convention has set up a special rapporteur for the rights of environmental defenders, which is one first example within the UN system that work together with a similar convention which recently was getting into force within Latin America, which is called the ESCAnVis Convention, which also brought an element about environmental defenders. And we kind of need to think about where citizen science becomes something that legal actors can use. What will it mean to have something that is an evidence? Where the citizen science and the evidence that will help to protect environmental protectors is coming along. We might have a human right for the environment coming along soon, and all these things may come together, and that's actually something that as a vision, as something that to look up for, towards, it's a potential that we all think about. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you for all the amazing people that I had a chance to work with on this materials. I'm looking forward to continue with, but that's kind of one signal of finishing with a certain bit of the story, and I would welcome all of you, those of you who are here in physical, to come over to the Discovery to a session.